And I don't know, is it better to have the lights down? I can see a little bit better. I don't know why I like this map. I think I like the colors. It's kind of a weird map otherwise, but this is just, I think it was a Southwest REGAP map. But this is just to give you an idea of the general area. This is the Arizona-New Mexico border, Animas Valley over here, Sonoita right here, Sonoita Valley. And you'll see that map again when I show some other locations. So I'm going to talk about 4 different projects that I've worked on over the years. So that means I can't really tell you much about anything other than to whet your appetite a little bit for what I've done, and you can talk to me later if you like. So the first one is my work on winter habitat associations on priority grassland birds. And this was done starting in 1999, initially starting out as 1999 to 2001. We were working on 7 different sites in southeastern Arizona, northern part of San Rafael Valley, the Research Ranch, the Babacomery Ranch in Jelks, and I have an old name here, it should be Las Ciénegas NCA, but Hilton and Davis Pasture on the NCA, and Buenos Aires Refuge over in the Altar Valley. And the objectives of this study were basically to learn a little bit more about the wintering bird community that inhabits these semi-desert and plains grasslands in southeastern Arizona, primarily focused on vegetative structure and composition as far as what their habitat was like, and figuring out which of these variables were particularly important in explaining the abundance of the suite of grassland birds. I'm not going to talk a bunch about the analysis here, other than to say that when we constructed our sets of models to look for associations, the 6 vegetation variables that we ended up looking at were shrub density, grass density, bare ground, standing dead litter, native grass, and something I kind of invented called protected foraging space that I'm not going to have time to explain, but if you want to ask me about it later, I can tell you. And we used 2 different sampling protocols. For those of you who've worked on grassland birds in the wintertime, you know that they are really hard. And they fly away from you and you go, beats the heck out of me. I'm not sure what that was. So we did 2 different things. For the really difficult ones, things like Baird's and grasshopper sparrows and savanna sparrows, which also look a whole lot like amodromus sparrows sometimes. We used this method that was developed by my colleague Caleb Gordon, who was a grad student at the time with the University of Arizona, and it has since moved on, we called it flush mist netting, and you set up 100 meters of mist net in the middle of this hourglass-shaped plot. You have 15 to 30 local volunteers come out and line up back here and run through the grassland and chase birds into the mist nets. And then you do all your veg measurements on this plot. And then for the birds that you can tell flying away from you, your Sprague's pipits or Vesper sparrows or meadowlarks or whatever, we used a more standard transect method, a little bit revised, using 3 people. So 1 person walked the transect line, and the other 2, not unlike what Carl did, were the dogs out there running back and forth and trying to flush the birds up that really want to act like mice and just run around on the grouse if they can. And I should say those are 4 different sparrow species. And I'm not going to ask you to look at all the details of this results slide, other than to just mostly look at this column over here. On the top half of the slide, what I'm showing you is that for Baird sparrows, which is one of the target birds of interest in the wintertime down here, these 3 models, incorporating these variables, were the best models that came out of our tests. And then looking at the parameter estimates for each of these variables, the 3 in red were the ones that were statistically significantly associated with abundance of Baird sparrows. And from the parameter estimate, you can see that in this case, they were all negatively associated. So the more shrub density, the less Baird sparrows, the higher the grass density, the less Baird sparrows, and the more standing dead litter, the less Baird sparrows. And since I don't have time to go into the details, this is a very, very quick summary shot of the other species that we had enough data on which to show to do these tests. So this was kind of a different one. It was the only non-passerine I was able to look at, but it didn't, perhaps won't surprise anybody, it didn't seem to care much about the various vegetation structures. But I did decide to add into the model total number of sparrows. And it's positively associated because they eat them. So that was kind of neat to see that it actually showed up that way. The other ones you can see, we were able to do horned larks, Sprague's pipits, although I'm not really happy with those models because our sample size was relatively small. vesper and savanna and grasshopper sparrows, we pooled meadowlark species because in the wintertime, if they're not even chucking or chirting, you can't tell them apart, and they're both here in the winter, both eastern and western, and then a total sparrow number. And so you can see it's sort of a variation of which particular veg structure were important to explain those, and some of the response associations were positive and some of them were negative. So in conclusion, one of the things, and I didn't show you a slide on this, but the vegetative structure and composition on the 7 plots was significantly different. I think for all 6 of the vegetation variables, there were differences between the sites in shrub densities and grass densities and things like that. So that adds something to the mix here of trying to figure out what the birds are responding to. Each of those 6 vegetation variables was important for at least one of the species in association with its abundance, and 5 of them were important for 2 or more of the species. We found some unexpected things. I kind of thought that there would be more responses, either positively or negatively, to shrub density. Part of that reason may be that we were not covering the whole continuum of shrub densities that were here. We were focused on open grassland birds. So, what we might have found if we had incorporated, sites like over in the Sonoritas where there's quite a bit of shrub component, that you might have seen something different because birds like sometimes somewhere along the continuum. They like a lot, they don't like very much, so depending on what you're looking at. And same sort of thing, I kind of expected more associations with whether it was mostly native or mostly exotic grasses. And some of those associations were even opposite of what one would expect based on some of the literature, which is mostly from the breeding season, but go figure. It's important to note that there were things that I didn't include in this study. It focused mostly on vegetative structure and composition, so there's clearly some issues or factors that are important to these birds that I didn't deal with, one of which was current and past grazing regimes. We did have grazed and ungrazed sites in our plots, obviously with the research ranch in Buenos Aires being ungrazed, but it wasn't well designed to make those comparisons, and as many of you know, grazed versus ungrazed is not the question. Because I could look at the San Rafael Valley, which looked a lot better in some senses for some of the vegetative structure than some of the ungrazed sites. So the variation in grazing is really different. And so clearly there's lots of research that needs to be done. Longer term is really important because 3 years of data for winter sparrows, the numbers just go like this. 1 year you have huge sparrow numbers, and next year you couldn't find a spizella to save your life. So secondly, I'm going to talk about something that expanded out of that winter study. I thought it was done in 2001, although it wasn't a very long study. However, in April of 2002, the Ryan wildfire swept across 28,000 acres of northern San Rafael and Sonoita Valley. The picture on the right is actually a picture, I believe, of the Ryan wildfire. This was a controlled burn on the Babacomery, but just for the flames. But that's a map of the extent of the Ryan wildfire. And it burned pretty much all of the research ranch. And so what I was able to do, I suddenly magically had pre-fire data. And so what I did is I went back to just 2 sites. I didn't have as much money or as many resources, so I went back to the research ranch, which had been burned, and to the Davis pasture on Las Ciénegas, which had not been. Repeated all the methodologies that I'd used on the winter to see once what we could find. For 3 years afterwards, that went from 2003 to 2005. And that's a picture of the research ranch in July after the April fire. Something important to note is I think that the timing of this fire is important in what you'll see with regard to some of my results, which are a little more equivocal than you might expect. Because this happened before the monsoons, not surprisingly, considering that's when it's really dry. But there was a monsoon between this time and the winter when I got there in the January of 2003. Didn't look like this in the wintertime. Although if you knew what you're looking for, you could tell that it had been burned. But there was grass out there, and to an uneducated eye, you might have thought it didn't look that much different. So I'm just going to show you a couple of quick things. These are measures of grass density. On the left is the research ranch, which was burned. On the right is Davis pasture, which was not. This is 2002 was the year of the fire. These are just 2 different measures of grass density. This is they're measures of grass hit. One is in the first decimeter above the ground, and the other one is in the second decimeter above the ground, just to give you a little bit of an idea. And you can see what you might have expected. On the burned site, after the fire, the grass densities go way down, and they stay pretty much down for those 3 years. And I mean, Carl and Jane have done some work on that, and that's sort of what people say, is about 3 years and things start to recover. It's kind of too bad I didn't have a fourth year to sort of start seeing the stuff coming back up. And just so you know, these are each different plots, so you can see that there is some variation within a year, you know, of some plots more than the others. This was a measure of standing dead litter, same sort of thing. Before the fire on the research ranch, afterwards standing dead litter is substantially reduced. On the Davis pasture, not. And in fact, this is sort of interesting. I mean, there hasn't been a fire on the Davis pasture, so one could say, you know, one could hypothesize that litter is accumulating, that whatever grazing, I mean, it's not a heavily grazed pasture, that over time litter is accumulating on that property during that time period anyway. This is sort of the opposite pattern, amount of bare ground. So on the research ranch, before the fire, things are pretty thick. After the fire, there's a lot more open, bare ground. Not that same kind of pattern, nothing really clear on Davis pasture because there wasn't any fire. Now thinking about what you just saw, and thinking about what I showed you before about the responses of the birds, Baird sparrows showing a negative response to grass density. So think about that, more grass density, less Baird sparrows. If there was less grass density after the fire, you would think maybe more Baird sparrows. It's not nearly as clear as that, as you can see. Now yellow is the research ranch, green is Davis pasture. Here's the fire. You might say, oh, well, look, it's lower after the fire. But it's no lower than it was in one of the 3 years before the fire. And there's this, you know, like what happened here, you know, here all of a sudden this big year, and that's on the Davis pasture, but also a relatively big year here. So it's not a pattern that you can see very clearly. I don't know how to explain that without further exploration. For the grasshopper sparrow, it was responding negatively to bare ground. So you might think less grasshopper sparrows after the fire because there's more bare ground. Again, you could say, oh, look, it's low. And it could be. This may represent a response to fire. But there was also this year, right before the fire, there were just no grasshopper sparrows to be found. And, you know, so who knows? This may represent some response to fire, but I also have a lot of concerns about in the wintertime. And in the wintertime, I'll talk a little bit more about breeding grasshopper sparrows next, but we have two subspecies of grasshopper sparrows because Propalidus comes down, the big Great Plains subspecies of grasshopper sparrow comes down here in the winter. So you know, it is of some concern to see that there be these numbers of low years. I can't say what's happened since then as far as winter birds, but it also could represent those incredible annual variations in birds in the winter time. They sometimes, if they don't find what they need here, they blow south. We're at the northwestern edge of their wintering range, and they just go to Mexico. That's my theory, is if they come here and there's not seed resources for them, they just keep going south. But they do show some site fidelity. So that they come here, let you look around and say, this is crappy, and they go to Mexico. And this was just one last slide. Ignore for the minute the ones with the hatch marks and just look at this is the research ranch, the violet ones. This was to look at total numbers of sparrows and what happened after the fire. And you can see that in 2003, on the research ranch, there was this big spike. And so what I did here was just to show you, there were 2 years where there were spikes. So I thought, well, in those years, let's see what they were. What comprised the largest number of those birds? And what it was there were huge numbers of Vesper sparrows that comprised part of this, and the other largest numbers were Savannah sparrows. So those seemed to respond to the fire the year afterwards, and then things kind of went back more to quote-unquote normal. Now I'm going to talk a little bit. How am I doing on time? 10 minutes. Okay, good. Work on abundance and distribution of Arizona grasshopper sparrows, comparing current and historical surveys. And for those of you who don't know, grasshopper sparrow is a pretty broadly distributed grassland bird in primarily the United States, a little bit into Canada and Mexico. But what was it? Oh, lost my train of thought. There is a subspecies, and this is a bad map because it doesn't show everything. The subspecies, the homologous, commonly called Arizona grasshopper sparrow, is found in southeastern Arizona into southwestern New Mexico in the Boot Heel, in northern Sonora, and as far as I can guess, into northern Chihuahua as well. It's a subspecies of conservation concern for both partners in flight and fish and wildlife, and it's an endangered subspecies in New Mexico. And so I've got these a little out of order, I think, but the places that I ended up working based on historical distribution of Arizona grasshopper sparrow, breeding Arizona grasshopper sparrows, was the Animas Valley, San Bernardino Valley, Sulphur Springs Valley, San Pedro, San Rafael, Sonoita, and Altar valleys. Represents, you can see that, I mean, that sort of pinkish and is patch, I forget what it was a regap map, south, Apacherean grasslands, I forget the title of it. But anyway, that gives you an idea of where I ended up working. I should have done this slide first, which is the objectives were to document current distribution and abundance in the United States using historical survey methods. And I didn't know this would happen, but there were two studies that were done, one in 1992 by Mills and one in a couple of years, including 1987, by Tom Strong, who is in the audience, and I had never actually met him live and in person before, so that was kind of fun. But anyway, since that time, since 87, nobody had gone back and tried to do those same kind of roadside surveys to see if there was any difference. If, what's happened to the numbers of grasshopper sparrows since then. People would give me anecdotal comments that said, "Oh, I just don't see like grasshopper sparrows like I used to." So I thought, well, let's do that. Let's repeat the historical surveys. Let's compare distribution and abundance with the historical data and see what we find. And I basically relocated from their publications the road segments that had been surveyed. In most cases, there were a few that I couldn't repeat because they either weren't any longer roads or they were no longer public or accessible. Most I was able to. It's sort of a BBS style survey for those of you who know that. Every half mile, do 3 minutes of recording whatever birds you hear and see. And then to be consistent with the historical methods, I also supplemented with some taped playback to see if you could pull up anybody else who was just sitting there being quiet. So this is not comparing to historical. This just represents the 2 years of 2004 and 2005 when I did my work. These are two ways of looking at the data. One is showing total numbers of singing males by valley that I recorded using maximums, because I sometimes did more than one survey on a segment, so I would use the maximum that I was able to record during that time. This one is singing male densities, which really is a better way to look at it, because the sample effort in any particular valley was not always exactly the same. So in other words, you surveyed more roads in the Sonoita Valley, you might get more total singing males just because you were sampling more habitat. So this density represents numbers of birds per average number of birds per point. And you can see, but the pattern is pretty much the same, and these are 2 years, that the 3 valleys, Sonoita, San Rafael, and Animas, continue to support the major populations of Arizona grasshopper sparrows. And then there are these other valleys that have these little sort of remnant populations that are still hanging on, and you just think, you don't know whether they're going to just wink out sometime or not. I did seem to find some interesting, a little bit more evidence of a bigger grasshopper sparrow population in the Altar Valley than the historical records seem to show, but it's still pretty small. Since we're in the Sonoita Valley, this map shows you the roads that were surveyed. So this is 83 or 82. This is 83 coming down to Sonoita. This is Upper and Lower Elgin Road. Here's the Research Ranch. This is Las Ciénegas Davis pasture and Hilton pasture, about as far up until you hit too many mesquites for there to be any grasshopper sparrows. So a few of these on this map were ones that were not historically surveyed that I added, but when I did the comparisons with historical surveys, I didn't include those data so that we could try to get a better feel. So here's a graph. In 82, this is showing singing male densities. 82 seems, and this is the common pattern that I saw pretty much in most of the valleys that I was looking at. So 82 appeared to have been sort of a lowish year, and 87 seemed to be really pretty high. My 2 years seemed to be intermediate, in between there. So no precipitous declines. 5, okay. So I'll quickly go through these. This was just San Rafael Valley. This is the only one there was actually a statistically significant difference between 82 and then these 3 you couldn't distinguish. And so this is a little bit of a different pattern. In 2005, there seemed to be quite a high density of grasshopper sparrows in the San Rafael Valley, and that's kind of a hopeful sign. It's probably less developed than any of these places, and you kind of cross your fingers and hope it's going to stay that way. And then this was the Animas Valley. No 1982 data for that, because at that point it hadn't been documented that Arizona grasshopper sparrow was breeding in the boot heel. That was discovered just prior to strong surveys by, what was her name, Julie Meets, I think, who was a grad student doing some work down there. So all we have is 87, similar pattern, but you don't know what's happened over here, obviously. This is, I won't have time to go into much detail about. This is probably more of concern than any of the other valleys. That we do have data that Sandy Williams has years worth of annual data that shows some really statistically significant declines, and that's probably a good reminder of me to say that these are points and not, there's no substitute for long-term continuous data sets, and that is not what this is. So you can't really say much about trends because you don't know what happened in between here or in between here. Was it going up or down, up or down? It's like, who knows? So it tells you something, but obviously long-term data would be better, and that's what we do have in the Animas Valley, which shows a significant decline. So in summary, those 3, the Sonoita, San Rafael, and Animas continue to support the largest populations. There was that pattern of lows in 82 and highs in 87, and 2004 and 2005 in general seem to be intermediate, with that exception of San Rafael. Still some small populations in the other valleys, and what I just said about the limitations of non-continuous data. And finally, I'm just going to talk quickly about something I'm doing now. Last year was the first year I got some funding from BLM to do some work. So I'm working on the research ranch here and on Davis pasture of Las Ciénegas. The objectives are to learn more about the breeding ecology of Arizona grasshopper sparrow subspecies. See what we can learn about territory size and nest placement, which I'm not having very much luck with because I can't find the nests. What the habitat looks like, breeding behavior, reproductive success, that kind of thing. So I'm using a combination of things. Still haven't worked this one out, the nest finding part, and you'll see in a minute why that might be. But mapping territories and measuring vegetation on territories and doing some random veg to compare it with to see if they're picking some particular things for their territories. We're doing, this year for the first time, we did targeted mist netting and color banding. So, going back, okay, so you can ask me about that, it's cool. Put the tapes out there, play it on the mist net, put the tapes out here at the base, play their song, and they go, wham! So this was just a grasshopper sparrow carrying food, so they're clearly producing young this is on Davis pasture. This is a grasshopper sparrow nest, the one I found last year. It builds its nest underneath a grass clump, and it builds a roof over it. So it's a tunnel. And so I walked around that grass clump 5 times after I was pretty sure it was there until I found the nest. So this is my last information slide. This is from last year. I just think this is cool. This is mapping the territories. So this is me out here. I find this guy and he's singing, and I follow him around with a GPS unit, and I just keep following every time he moves to a different stalk until I have about 20 points, and then he sort of self-defines his territory. And it was interesting. Maybe I better stop because in case there's any questions, you can ask me some more about that, about the comparisons between the average territory size. And that's just some acknowledgments of people who either provided funding or access or assistance in some way to my study. Do we have any time for questions? 30 seconds for questions. Okay, one question, and then when we have our questions at the end, I can take some more if you want.
Okay.
Yes?
It sounds like you did not find any correlation or pattern or effects of any invasive plants?
It wasn't showing up in the models. We had that one, there was one you may have seen, Sprague's pipit, but it was opposite of what I would have expected based on the literature. They seemed to be negatively responding to to native grasses, which meant that they were positively associated with exotics. And the literature, at least from the breeding season, suggests that they had the opposite response. I think it might be a sample size issue. I don't know why there's not that, but certainly when I'm out here mapping grasshopper sparrow territories in the breeding season, they're using some of those territories are almost completely Lehmann's lovegrass. So it's not like they're avoiding it. There may be some patterns, and we'll see once when I actually analyze those data whether that's any different. But I was surprised by that. Okay, so I can take questions later.